Young girl chased by drunken stepfather until she meets cowboy. The sun hung low in the sky, a fiery orb sinking behind the jagged hills of the Wild West. Its golden rays stretched across the dusty plains, painting the world in hues of amber and shadow. In a small, weathered cabin perched on the outskirts of a forgotten town, Delilah Rose sat by a cracked window, her nimble fingers working a needle through the frayed fabric of her dress. The tear she mended was small, but it mirrored the larger rips in her life, ones she couldn't so easily stitch shut. Her chestnut hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, framing a face that carried both grace and a quiet, unshakable sadness. Her eyes, deep and soulful, shimmered with a beauty that went beyond skin, reflecting a spirit battered yet unbroken. Outside, the wind whispered through the dry grass, a lonesome sound that matched the ache in Delilah's chest. She was 19, but the weight of her years felt heavier than it should. Her stepfather, a man whose name sent shivers through the town's whispers, ruled her world like a storm cloud that never broke. His presence was a constant threat, his breath sharp with whiskey, his voice a thunderclap of anger. For as long as she could remember, he'd been the chains that bound her to this crumbling cabin, a prison dressed up as a home. Every night she braced herself for his return, knowing the creak of the door would bring not comfort but fear. Tonight was no different, or so she thought. As the shadows lengthened and the light faded, Delilah's hands paused over her sewing. Something stirred inside her, a flicker of defiance she hadn't dared to name before. It wasn't loud or brash. It was a quiet thing, a whisper that grew stronger with each heartbeat. "Run it," said. "You don't have to stay." She pressed her lips together, her gaze drifting to the horizon where the hills stood like silent sentinels. Beyond them lay a world she'd only dreamed of, wild, vast, and free. Could she really leave? Could she step into the unknown and shed the life that had kept her small? The answer came with the groan of the cabin door swinging open. Delilah's heart leapt into her throat, her fingers tightening around the needle. Heavy boots thudded against the wooden floor, each step a hammer strike against her fragile calm. Delilah, her stepfather, roared, his voice thick with drink and menace. She rose to her feet, her hands clenching at her sides, her mind racing. There was no hiding from him, not in this tiny space where every corner held a shadow. She turned to face him as he stumbled into the room, his bloodshot eyes wild, his hulking frame filling the doorway. "Where's my dinner, girl?" he growled, swaying as he leaned against the table. His dirty shirt hung loose, stained with sweat and liquor, and his beard was matted with neglect. Delilah forced a smile, though it felt like a mask slipping over her fear. "It's ready, Pa," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. She gestured to the table where a simple meal waited, bread and stew, the best she could manage with what little they had. He grunted, collapsing into a chair with a groan, his gaze pinning her like a hawk eyeing its prey. She moved quickly, serving him with practiced care, her every step measured to avoid his wrath. But as she worked, her thoughts drifted far beyond the cabin walls. She'd heard tales of the Wild West from travelers, passing through stories of cowboys riding the open plains of outlaws, dodging the law of a life where danger and freedom danced hand in hand. She imagined herself out there, the wind in her hair, no longer a bird trapped in a cage, but an eagle soaring above the mountains. The dream felt so close, yet so impossibly far. The night dragged on the cabin, growing quiet, save for her stepfather's drunken snores. He'd passed out in his chair, his head lolling back, a bottle still clutched in his hand. Delilah stood by the window, staring out at the moonlit plains. This was her chance. The whisper of courage had become a shout urging her to act. She didn't have much, just a small bundle of clothes, a locket with her mother's faded photograph, and a heart pounding with both terror and hope. With trembling hands, she gathered her things, casting one last look at the cabin that had held her captive for so long. Stepping outside the cool night air kissed her skin, a sharp contrast to the stifling heat of her fear. The town slept around her, its ramshackle buildings dark and still. She moved silently, her boots soft against the dirt, each step pulling her further from the life she'd known. The moon hung low, a silver guide lighting her path as she slipped past the last house and into the open wilderness. Her breath came fast, a mix of exhilaration and dread swirling in her chest. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't turn back. As the first hints of dawn touched the sky, painting it with streaks of pink and gold, Delilah reached the edge of a vast desert. The land stretched out before her, endless and untamed, a sea of sand and rock that promised both peril and possibility. She paused, her breath catching as she took it all in. This was the Wild West she dreamed of, a place where nightmares and dreams collided, where a girl like her could either break or become something new. She straightened her shoulders, her resolve hardening like steel. Whatever lay ahead, she'd face it. She had nothing left to lose. Unbeknownst to her, fate was already weaving its threads. Far across the plains, a lone figure rode beneath the rising sun, his silhouette sharp against the light. Silas Wright, a cowboy with a past shrouded in mystery, was a man of the wild, free as the wind, yet tethered by secrets he kept close. He didn't know it yet, but his path was about to cross with a girl whose bravery would stir something deep within him, something he'd thought long buried. For now, Delilah walked alone, her steps steady, her heart alight with a fragile hope. The Wild West stretched out before her, a canvas of danger and dreams ready to paint her story in bold, unforgettable strokes. She was no longer just a girl running from a drunken stepfather. She was a spark, a flame waiting to ignite, and the world would soon know her name. The desert stretched endlessly before Delilah rose, a vast, sun-scorched expanse that seemed to hum with secrets older than the hills. Her boots crunched against the cracked earth, each step kicking up small clouds of dust that clung to the hem of her faded dress. The locket at her throat, heavy with her mother's memory, bounced softly against her chest as she moved, a quiet reminder of why she'd run. Dawn had given way to a blazing morning, the sun climbing higher, its heat pressing down like a heavy hand. Delilah's throat was dry, her lips chapped, but the fire in her heart burned brighter than the desert's glare. She was free, at least for now. She hadn't slept, hadn't stopped since slipping away from the cabin under the moon's watchful gaze. Fear had kept her moving, the echo of her stepfather's drunken roar still ringing in her ears. She could almost feel his shadow at her back, his heavy boots pounding the earth, ready to drag her back to that suffocating life. But the plains were empty behind her, save for the wind that stirred the sagebrush and the distant cry of a hawk circling above. Delilah tightened her grip on her small bundle of belongings, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of shelter or danger. The Wild West was no place for a girl alone, but alone was better than chained. As the day wore on, the landscape shifted. The flat desert gave way to rocky outcrops, their jagged shapes rising like the bones of some ancient beast. Delilah's legs ached, her steps growing heavier, but she pressed on, driven by a stubborn will that refused to bend. She'd heard stories of bandits hiding in these parts, of rattlesnakes that struck without warning, of travelers who vanished into the dust and were never seen again. Yet those same stories spoke of towns tucked beyond the hills, of rivers that sparkled like hope, of people who might offer a kind word or a place to rest. She clung to that thought, letting it pull her forward. By midday, the heat was relentless, shimmering off the rocks in waves that made the world seem to waver. Delilah's vision blurred, her steps faltering as she climbed a low rise. At the top, she paused, her breath ragged, and squinted into the distance. There, just at the edge of her sight, was a faint smudge of green, an oasis or perhaps a mirage. Her heart leapt, a mix of hope and caution. Water meant life, but it also drew others, not all of them friendly. She adjusted her bundle and started toward it, her pace quickening despite her exhaustion. The green smudge grew clearer as she approached, revealing a cluster of cottonwood trees huddled around a small, clear spring. The sight was like a balm to her weary soul. She dropped to her knees beside the water, cupping her hands to drink the coolness, soothing her parched throat. For a moment, she let herself rest, the world narrowing to the ripple of the spring and the rustle of leaves overhead. She splashed water on her face, her chestnut hair clinging to her cheeks, her eyes catching the light with a spark of defiance. She wasn't broken yet, not by her stepfather, not by the dessert, not by anything. But the Wild West was never a place for lingering dreams. A sharp crack split the air, a twig snapping underfoot, too deliberate to be the wind. Delilah froze her hand instinctively, reaching for the small knife tucked in her bundle. Her eyes darted to the shadows beyond the trees where the air seemed to hold its breath. Another sound followed, the faint jingle of spurs, soft but unmistakable. Someone was here watching her. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to stand her stance steady, despite the fear clawing at her chest. "Who's there?" she called, her voice cutting through the silence sharper than she'd expected. The shadows shifted and a figure stepped into the light. He was tall, his frame lean but strong, dressed in the dust-worn clothes of a man who lived on the move. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but his eyes piercing steady, in a shade of gray like storm clouds locked onto hers. A rifle rested easily in his hands, its barrel pointed down, a gesture that spoke of caution rather than threat. "Didn't mean to startle you, miss," he said, his voice low and rough like gravel smoothed by a river. "Just passing through. Name's Silas Wright." Delilah's grip on her knife tightened, though she kept it hidden behind her bundle. She studied him, taking in the weathered lines of his face, the stubble along his jaw, the way he stood with a quiet confidence that seemed born of the land itself. He didn't look like a bandit, but out here looks meant nothing. "You alone?" she asked, her tone guarded, her eyes never leaving his. Silas tilted his head, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Reckon I could ask you the same. Ain't many folks wander this far out without a reason." He took a step closer, slow and deliberate, his spurs jingling softly. "You running from something or to something?" The question hit her like a gust of wind, stirring up truths she wasn't ready to share. She straightened, her chin lifting. "Maybe both," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of his gaze. "You got a habit of asking strangers their business." His smile widened just enough to show a flash of warmth beneath his guarded exterior. "Only when they look like they're carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders?" He nodded toward the spring. "Mind if I water my horse? Been riding since dawn, and she's thirstier than I am." Delilah hesitated, her instincts torn between caution and curiosity. There was something about him, something in the way he moved, the way he spoke, that didn't feel like a threat. "Not yet." She stepped back, giving him space. "Go ahead," she said, her eyes still sharp, watching his every move. Silas led a sturdy bay mare from the shadows, her coat gleaming despite the dust. He murmured to her softly, his hands gentle as he guided her to the spring. Delilah watched, her tension easing just a fraction. A man who cared for his horse like that couldn't be all bad, could he? But she knew better than to trust too quickly. The Wild West was full of wolves in sheep's clothing. As Silas filled his canteen, he glanced at her, his eyes catching the sunlight. "You got a name, miss, or you just a ghost wandering the desert?" "Delilah," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop it. She didn't offer more and he didn't press, though his gaze lingered, as if he could see the story written in her eyes. She turned away, pretending to adjust her bundle, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't name. The silence stretched, broken only by the horse's soft drinking and the whisper of the wind. Delilah's thoughts churned. She was alone, far from anything familiar, and now here was the stranger, a cowboy who seemed to carry his own ghosts. Was he a savior or just another danger in disguise? She didn't know, but the desert had a way of revealing truths, and she sensed their paths were now entwined, whether she liked it or not. Far off, a faint plume of dust rose on the horizon, too purposeful to be a trick at the heat. Someone was coming fast. Delilah's breath caught her eyes, darting to Silas. He'd seen it too, his hand resting lightly on his rifle, his expression unreadable. The Wild West was about to test them both, and the spark of their meeting was only the beginning of a fire that would either save them or burn them to ash. The plume of dust on the horizon grew larger, a dark smudge against the blazing noon sky, moving with a speed that sent a chill through Delilah Rose's veins. She stood by the spring, her heart hammering the small knife in her hand, feeling woefully inadequate. Beside her, Silas Wright's posture had shifted, his easy demeanor replaced by a coiled tension like a panther ready to spring. His gray eyes narrowed, tracking the approaching riders, his hand steady on the rifle now slung across his shoulder. The air around them seemed to thicken, charged with the promise of trouble, and Delilah's instincts screamed that whatever was coming wasn't just a passing stranger. "Who are they?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustle of the cottonwood leaves. Her eyes flicked to Silas, searching for answers in his unreadable expression. The cowboy didn't answer right away. His gaze locked on the dust cloud, now close enough to reveal the shapes of three horses, their riders hunched low, driving them hard across the desert. "Trouble," Silas said finally, his voice low and clipped, carrying a weight that made her stomach twist. He stepped closer to his mare, patting her flank as if to steady them both, but his eyes never left the horizon. "Best get ready, Delilah. Ain't no telling what they want, but men riding like that ain't usually looking to share a meal." Delilah's mind raced, her thoughts tumbling back to the cabin she'd fled to, the man whose shadow still loomed over her life. Could it be him? Had her stepfather tracked her this far, his rage fueled by whiskey and vengeance? The thought sent a surge of panic through her, but she forced it down, her jaw tightening. She wasn't the girl who cowered anymore. She'd run into the Wild West to find her strength, and she wouldn't let fear steal it now. The riders were close enough now to make out details: three men, their faces obscured by bandanas pulled, high hats pulled low. The glint of sunlight on metal caught her eye, and her breath hitched. Guns. Each man carried a revolver at his hip, and the lead rider had a rifle strapped across his back, much like Silas. They weren't just travelers, they were hunters. Delilah's grip on her knife tightened, her knuckles whitening. She glanced at Silas, expecting him to mount his horse and ride, but he stood his ground, his stance calm yet unyielding, like a man who'd faced worse odds and lived to tell the tale. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice steady but firm, leaving no room for argument. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Delilah and the approaching riders, his rifle now held loosely at his side, ready to snap up in an instant. Delilah hesitated, her pride bristling at the thought of hiding, but the raw edge in his tone told her this wasn't the time to argue. She moved back, crouching slightly behind a cottonwood, her eyes darting between Silas and the riders. The men reined in their horses a dozen yards away, the animals snorting and stamping, kicking up clouds of dust that swirled in the air. The lead rider, a broad-shouldered man with a scar slashing across his cheek, pulled down his bandana, revealing a sneer that made Delilah's skin crawl. His eyes, cold and predatory, swept over the scene, lingering on her for a moment too long before settling on Silas. Well, now, he drawled, his voice oily with menace. "What do we got here? A lone cowboy and a pretty little thing, all by their lonesome in the middle of nowhere." Silas didn't flinch, his expression as hard as the desert rock. "Just passing through," he said, his tone even, but there was a steel beneath it that matched the glint in his eyes. "You boys looking for something particular, or you just out for a ride?" The scarred man laughed, a harsh, grating sound that sent a shiver down Delilah's spine. "Oh, we're looking all right. Word is a girl ran off from a certain town not far from here. Young brown hair, eyes that could make a man forget his manners." His gaze flicked to Delilah again, and her blood ran cold. "Seems she's worth a pretty penny to someone who wants her back real bad." Delilah's heart stopped. Her stepfather. It had to be him. He'd sent these men, these wolves, to hunt her down, to drag her back to the hell she'd escaped. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt rooted to the ground, her breath trapped in her chest. Silas shifted slightly, his body angled to shield her, and she caught the faintest tightening of his jaw. He knew what this was about, too. Ain't no girl like that here, Silas said, his voice calm, but laced with a warning. Just me and my friend heading west. You'd best keep riding. The scarred man's sneer widened, and his two companions shifted in their saddles, their hands hovering near their guns. That, so he said, leaning forward, his eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. Funny thing, cowboy. I don't believe you. The world seemed to hold its breath. Delilah's pulse thundered in her ears, her fingers trembling around the knife. She didn't know, Silas didn't know if he'd risk his life for a stranger like her, but something in his stance, the unyielding set of his shoulders, the quiet fire in his eyes told her he wasn't the kind of man to back down. And then in a heartbeat, everything exploded into chaos. The scarred man's hand flashed to his revolver, but Silas was faster, impossibly fast. His rifle snapped up the crack of a shot, splitting the air like thunder. The scarred man's horse reared a bullet, grazing its flank, and the rider cursed, struggling to stay mounted. The other two men drew their guns, but Silas was already moving, diving to the side, as bullets tore into the ground where he'd stood. Delilah's scream caught in her throat as she ducked behind the tree. Her knife raised, her mind racing with terror and defiance. "Run!" Silas shouted, his voice cutting through the gunfire. He fired again, the shot clipping one of the rider's hats, sending it spinning into the dust. But Delilah didn't run. She couldn't not when he was fighting for her, not when her own freedom was at stake. She lunged forward, her knife flashing as she slashed at the reins of the nearest horse, sending it bolting in panic. The rider cursed, tumbling from the saddle, and Delilah scrambled back, her heart pounding with a wild, reckless courage she hadn't known she possessed. Silas moved like a shadow, his movements precise, almost graceful as he fired and dodged, keeping the riders off balance. But they were outnumbered, and the scarred man had regained control of his horse, his revolver now aimed squarely at Silas. "You're a dead man, cowboy," he roared, pulling the trigger. Time seemed to slow. Delilah's breath caught as Silas twisted the bullet, grazing his shoulder, tearing through his shirt. Blood bloomed against the fabric, but he didn't falter. With a snarl, he fired back his shot, striking the scarred man's hand, sending the revolver flying. The man howled, clutching his bleeding fingers, and for a moment the tide seemed to turn. But then a new sound shattered the chaos, a low, guttural shout from the direction of the desert. Delilah's blood froze as another rider crested the rise, his silhouette unmistakable even at a distance. The heavy build, the slouch of a man too long in the bottle. It was her stepfather. He'd come himself, his rage a storm that would tear through anything in its path. And he wasn't alone. Two more riders flanked him, their guns already drawn. Silas cursed under his breath, his eyes meeting Delilah's for a fleeting moment. In that glance, she saw not fear, but a fierce determination, a promise that he wouldn't let her fall. "Stay low," he said, his voice a lifeline in the storm. This ain't over. The desert had become a battlefield, and Delilah realized with a jolt that her fight for freedom had only just begun. The Wild West was testing her, forging her in fire, and the cowboy at her side was either her salvation or her doom. The air was thick with dust and the acrid tang of gunpowder as Delilah crouched behind the cottonwood, her heart pounding so fiercely she thought it might burst. The sight of her stepfather cresting the rise, his massive frame looming like a storm cloud, sent a wave of dread crashing over her. His bloodshot eyes locked onto her even from a distance, and the snarl twisting his face was one she knew too well, a promise of pain. Flanked by two more riders, their guns glinting in the harsh sunlight, he was a nightmare made flesh come to drag her back to the cage she'd fought so hard to escape. But Silas Wright stood between her and that fate, his rifle steady, despite the blood seeping from his shoulder, his gray eyes burning with a defiance that matched her own. Delilah, her stepfather, bellowed, his voice, a drunken roar that echoed across the desert. "You think you can run from me, girl? I'll have you back, and you'll regret every step you took." His horse snorted, pawing the ground as he spurred it closer, his companions fanning out to block any chance of escape. The scarred man and his remaining rider, still reeling from Silas's shots, scrambled to regroup, their curses mingling with the wind. Silas didn't flinch, but Delilah caught the slight wince as he shifted his weight, the blood stain on his shirt spreading like a dark omen. "Stay low." He repeated, his voice a low growl, but there was a flicker of something else in his tone, concern. Maybe, or something deeper that made her chest tighten. She wanted to snap back to tell him she wasn't some damsel who needed coddling, but the words stuck in her throat as another shot rang out, splintering the bark of a nearby tree. She ducked lower, her knife still clutched in her hand, her mind racing for a way to fight back. "Reckon we got ourselves a bit of a mess," Silas muttered almost to himself, as he reloaded his rifle with a speed that spoke of years on the trail. He glanced at her, and despite the chaos, a wry grin tugged at his lips. "You always bring this much trouble with you, Delilah? Or is today special?" The question caught her off guard, and she let out a shaky laugh, the sound surprising even herself. "Just my luck," she shot back, her voice steadier than she felt. "Seems I can't go a day without someone trying to ruin it." The humor felt like a lifeline, a fleeting moment of lightness in the storm, and she clung to it, her eyes meeting Silas's. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to just them, a spark of understanding passing between them that made her forget the danger closing in. But the moment shattered as her stepfather's voice boomed again, closer now. "You cowboy," he shouted, his words slurred but venomous. "Step away from my girl, or I'll put a bullet through you myself." He raised his revolver, his hand unsteady, but his intent clear. His companions drew their weapons, and the scarred man, nursing his wounded hand, grinned like a wolf scenting blood. Silas didn't bother responding with words. He fired the shot, kicking up dirt at the hooves of her stepfather's horse, sending it rearing with a panicked whinny. The old man cursed, struggling to stay in the saddle, his bulk swaying dangerously. One of his riders wasn't so lucky. Silas's next shot grazed the man's arm, and he yelped, dropping his gun as his horse bolted. Delilah couldn't help but smirk at the sight of small victory in the chaos, but her amusement faded as her stepfather regained control, his face purple with rage. "Enough of this," he roared, spurring his horse forward, his revolver aimed at Silas. Delilah's breath caught her body moving before her mind could catch up. She lunged from behind the tree, her knife flashing as she slashed at the air, a desperate warning to keep him back. The move was reckless, and she knew it the moment her stepfather's eyes locked onto her, his snarl twisting into something uglier. "You little," he started, but his words cut off as Silas grabbed Delilah's arm, yanking her back just as another shot rang out. The bullet grazed the ground where she'd stood, and she stumbled, her heart racing as Silas pulled her behind a boulder, his grip firm but not rough. "You trying to get yourself killed?" he hissed, his face inches from hers, his eyes blazing with a mix of exasperation and worry. "I'm trying to fight," she snapped, her voice trembling with adrenaline. "I won't let him take me back, Silas. I'd rather die out here than go back to that." Her words hung between them, raw and unyielding, and for a moment Silas's expression softened, as if he saw the fire in her soul and recognized it as kin to his own. "Well, ain't that a fine sentiment?" he said, his tone dry but laced with a grudging respect. "But let's try living instead, all right? I ain't keen on burying anyone today." He flashed that wry grin again, and despite the gunfire and the shouts closing in, Delilah felt a strange warmth bloom in her chest. This cowboy with his bloodied shoulder and sharp tongue was risking everything for her, and she didn't know why, but she was starting to want to find out. The situation took an awkward turn as Silas tried to reload his rifle only to fumble with the bullets, his injured shoulder slowing him down. "Damn it all," he muttered, glancing at her with a sheepish look that was almost comical in its timing. "Don't suppose you're handy with a gun, are you?" Delilah raised an eyebrow, her lips twitching despite the danger. You handed me your rifle, cowboy, or you just gonna keep dropping bullets like a greenhorn. The jab slipped out before she could stop it, and Silas let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. Fair point, he said, finally slotting the bullets into place. But the moment of levity was cut short as the scarred man and the remaining riders closed in their horses, circling like vultures. Delilah's stepfather dismounted his boots, hitting the ground with a thud that echoed like a death knell. He staggered toward them, his revolver raised, his eyes wild with a mix of fury and desperation. "You think you can steal what's mine?" He slurred, his voice dripping with venom as he glared at Silas. "She's my property, cowboy. You're meddling in things you don't understand." Silas stood, his rifle ready, his body a shield between Delilah and her stepfather. "She ain't nobody's property," he said, his voice low and dangerous, each word cutting like a blade. "You want her? You'll have to go through me." The standoff was electric, the air crackling with tension. Delilah's heart pounded, her eyes darting between Silas's steady form and her stepfather's trembling rage. The scarred man and the other rider hesitated, their confidence shaken by Silas's unyielding stance, but her stepfather was too far gone to back down. He raised his revolver, his finger tightening on the trigger, and Delilah knew this was it, the moment that would decide her fate. But then a new sound broke through the chaos, a low rumbling growl that didn't belong to man or horse. Delilah's eyes widened as she caught a flicker of movement in the rocks above a shadow that wasn't human. Silas tensed his gaze, flicking upward, and even her stepfather paused, his drunken bravado faltering. The desert was alive, and it had its own plans for them all. "Silas," Delilah whispered, her voice barely audible, her hand reaching for his arm. "What in the hell is that?" He didn't answer, but his grin was gone, replaced by a grim determination that told her the fight was far from over. The Wild West was about to throw them a curveball, and whatever was coming next would test every ounce of their courage and their trust in each other. The low rumbling growl from the rocks above sent a shiver through Delilah Rose, her hand tightening on Silas Wright's arm as the desert seemed to hold its breath. The shadow in the crag shifted, a fleeting glimpse of tawny fur and glinting eyes, a mountain lion, its presence a stark reminder that the Wild West spared no one, not even those already locked in a deadly standoff. Her stepfather froze, his revolver still raised, but his drunken bravado wavering, his bloodshot eyes darting to the rocks. The scarred man and his companion hesitated, their horses snorting nervously, while Silas stood steady, his rifle ready, his gaze flicking between the human threat and the new danger lurking above. "Stay close," Silas murmured, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through Delilah, grounding her in the chaos. His arm, warm and solid beneath her touch, was a lifeline, and she realized with a jolt how close they'd become. Her body pressed near his, her breath mingling with his in the tense air. The heat of the moment, the brush of his sleeve against her skin, sent a flush through her, unexpected and dizzying. She pulled her hand back, her cheeks burning, suddenly aware of the intensity in his storm-gray eyes as they met hers for a fleeting second. "Reckon we got bigger problems than your old man," Silas said, his tone carrying a hint of that wry humor, though his focus remained sharp. He nodded toward the rocks where the mountain lion's growl had softened to a menacing hiss. Delilah's stepfather, still swaying from drink, cursed under his breath, his revolver swinging wildly between Silas and the unseen beast. "Damn it all," he slurred, his voice cracking. "This ain't your fight, cowboy. Hand her over and you walk away." Silas's jaw tightened, his body shifting to shield Delilah further. "Told you before," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "she ain't yours to take." The words sent a warmth through Delilah, a spark of something deeper than gratitude. His defiance, his willingness to stand against the odds for her. A stranger stirred a longing she hadn't dared to name. It was more than protection. It was a promise, one that made her heart race in ways that had nothing to do with the danger around them. The standoff stretched taut, the air thick with tension, until the mountain lion made its move. With a sudden snarl, it leapt from the rocks, a blur of muscle and claws, landing between the group and the spring. The horses screamed, rearing in panic, and Delilah's stepfather stumbled back, his shot going wide and kicking up dirt. The scarred man's companion bolted his horse, galloping into the desert, leaving the scarred man cursing and fumbling for his gun. Silas seized the moment, grabbing Delilah's hand and pulling her toward a narrow gap in the rocks. Move. He barked, his grip firm but gentle, his touch sending a jolt through her that was equal parts fear and something else. Something that made her skin tingle where his fingers pressed against hers. They scrambled into the crevice, the rough stones scraping her arms as they squeezed through the lion's roar echoing behind them. Delilah's heart pounded, her breath coming in short gasps, but Silas's presence beside her was a steady anchor, his strength a quiet reassurance in the chaos. They emerged into a shallow cave, the dim light casting shadows across the uneven walls. The sounds of the standoff faded, muffled by the rock, leaving only the ragged rhythm of their breathing. Silas released her hand, stepping back to check the entrance, his rifle still at the ready. Delilah leaned against the cool stone, her chest heaving, her mind reeling from the whirlwind of danger and from the way her body still hummed from his touch. "You all right?" Silas asked, turning to her, his eyes searching her face. The blood on his shoulder had darkened the wound, clearly painful, but he didn't complain. His voice was softer now, laced with a concern that made her stomach flutter. In the half-light of the cave, his features seemed sharper, more defined, the strong line of his jaw, the faint scar above his brow, the way his hat cast a shadow over his eyes, making them seem deeper, more inviting. "I'm fine," Delilah said, though her voice trembled, betraying the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She pushed her chestnut hair back, her fingers brushing the locket at her throat, a reminder of the life she'd left behind. But here in this moment was Silas, so close that life felt distant, like a dream she was waking from. "You're the one bleeding?" she added, nodding toward his shoulder, her tone sharper to mask the heat rising in her cheeks. Silas glanced at his wound, shrugging as if it were nothing. "Ain't the first time," he said, but his grin was tight and he winced as he shifted. Delilah stepped closer, her hands moving almost on their own, reaching for the torn fabric of his shirt. "Hold still," she said, her voice firm, despite the tremor in her fingers. She peeled back the cloth, revealing a graze that was deeper than she'd expected, the skin raw and red. Her breath caught not just at the sight of the wound, but at the warmth of his skin under her fingertips, the steady rise and fall of his chest. Silas went still, his eyes locking onto hers, and the air between them thickened, charged with a tension that had nothing to do with the danger outside. Her hands lingered, her touch careful but deliberate, and she felt the heat of his gaze, the way it traced the curve of her face, her lips, her eyes. "You don't have to," he started, his voice rough, but he didn't pull away, and neither did she. "I want to," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. She tore a strip from the hem of her dress, her movements quick to cover the sudden rush of vulnerability. She wrapped the cloth around his shoulder, tying it tightly to stem the bleeding, her fingers brushing against his skin with every knot. Each touch sent a spark through her, a warmth that spread from her hands to her core, and she wondered if he felt it too. The pull, the unspoken connection that seemed to grow stronger with every heartbeat. "Reckon you're handier than I thought." Silas said, his voice low, a teasing edge, softening the intensity of the moment. But his eyes told a different story, their storm-gray depths holding hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch. For a moment, they were just a man and a woman, not a cowboy and a runaway, not prey in a predator's game. The cave felt smaller, the world outside distant, and Delilah was acutely aware of how close they stood, the heat of his body, the faint scent of leather and sweat that clung to him. She stepped back, her cheeks flushing, suddenly awkward under his gaze. "Don't get used to it," she said, trying for humor but hearing the tremor in her voice. "I ain't your nurse." The words were meant to lighten the moment, But they only deepened the charge between them, his faint smile making her heart skip. Before Silas could respond, a shout from outside shattered the moment her stepfather's voice, cutting through the rock like a blade. Delilah. You can't hide forever, girl. The mountain lion's snarl followed, mingling with the clatter of hooves and the scarred man's curses. The danger hadn't passed, it had only paused, waiting to pounce. Silas's expression hardened, the playful spark replaced by the steel of a man ready to fight. We ain't out of this yet, he said, checking his rifle, his movements swift despite the pain in his shoulder. He glanced at her, his eyes softening for a fleeting moment. Stay with me, Delilah. Whatever happens, we face it together. She nodded, her throat tight, her heart torn between fear and the growing pull toward this man who'd become her shield, her ally, and maybe something more. The Wild West was a crucible forging them in fire, and as the sounds of pursuit grew louder, Delilah knew the flames were about to burn hotter still. The cave's dim light seemed to pulse with the weight of Delilah Rose's racing heart, her stepfather's bellowing threats echoing through the stone, like a storm breaking against a cliff. The mountain lion's snarl wove through the chaos, a wild counterpoint to the human danger closing in. Silas Wright stood at the cave's entrance, his rifle steady his wounded shoulder, bound by the strip of Delilah's dress. Though the blood still seeped through, a dark reminder of the fight they were barely surviving. His words, "We face it together," hung in the air, a vow that tethered her to him, even as fear and the strange warmth of their earlier moment churned inside her. Delilah gripped her knife, her eyes locked on Silas's back, his silhouette a beacon of strength against the looming threat. But the Wild West had a way of turning even the bravest plans to dust, and what came next would shake her to her core. Her stepfather's voice grew louder, closer, each word dripping with venom. Delilah, you ungrateful wretch. You think you can run from me? I'll drag you back myself. The clatter of hooves and the scarred man's shouted orders told her the riders were circling, cutting off any hope of escape. The mountain lion's growls had faded, as if the beast had slipped back into the shadows, leaving the humans to their own savagery. Delilah's breath hitched, her mind racing for a way out, but the cave felt like a trap, its walls closing in as tightly as her stepfather's grip on her past. Silas glanced back at her, his gray eyes sharp with a plan she couldn't yet read. We can't stay here, he said, his voice low but urgent. They'll flush us out or wait us out, and I ain't keen on either. He nodded toward a narrow fissure at the back of the cave, barely visible in the dim light. That might lead somewhere. You ready to take a chance? Delilah nodded, her throat too tight for words. The idea of crawling through a dark, unknown passage was terrifying, but staying meant facing her stepfather's wrath, and she'd rather face 1,000 unknowns than that. She followed Silas as he moved toward the fissure, his movements careful but swift, his rifle slung over his good shoulder. The passage was tight, the air cool and damp, the walls scraping against her arms as she squeezed through behind him. Her heart pounded not just from fear but from the closeness of him, the way his presence filled the narrow space, steady and unyielding. They emerged into a wider chamber, the air cooler, the faint drip of water echoing somewhere in the dark. Silas held up a hand, signaling her to stop, his eyes scanning the shadows. Wait, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Something ain't right. Before Delilah could ask what he meant, a new sound cut through the silence, a low, deliberate scrape like boots on stone coming from deeper within the cave. Her blood ran cold. They weren't alone. Silas raised his rifle, his body tensing, but before he could act, a figure stepped into the faint light filtering through a crack above. It wasn't her stepfather or his men. It was a woman, her silhouette sharp and commanding, dressed in a long duster coat that brushed the ground. Her hair was pulled back in a tight braid, and her eyes, dark and piercing, locked onto Silas with a familiarity that made Delilah's stomach twist. A revolver hung at her hip, and her stance was that of someone who knew how to use it. Silas Wright, the woman said, her voice smooth, but edged with something dangerous like a blade wrapped in silk. You've got a knack for getting yourself into messes, don't you? Her gaze flicked to Delilah, taking her in with a quick, assessing look that felt like a challenge. And you've picked up a stray. Care to explain? Delilah's breath caught her mind reeling. This woman knew Silas knew him well from the way her words carried a weight of history, but it was the way Silas froze his expression, shifting from steely resolve to something raw, almost haunted, that sent a jolt through her. Clara, he said, his voice rough, the single word heavy with a story Delilah didn't know, but suddenly needed to. What the hell are you doing here? The woman Clara smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Could ask you the same, but I reckon I already know. You're playing hero again, aren't you? Always had a soft spot for damsels in distress. Her eyes lingered on Delilah, and there was a flicker of something jealousy maybe, or amusement that made Delilah's cheeks burn. Who is she? Delilah demanded, her voice sharper than she intended, her knife still clutched in her hand. The question was for Silas, but Clara answered, stepping closer, her boots echoing in the chamber. Someone who knows Silas better than you ever will, darling. Clara said, her tone teasing, but laced with a sting. And someone who's about to save your hides if you're smart enough to listen. She gestured toward the back of the chamber, where another passage loomed barely visible in the shadows. That way out's clear, but it won't be for long. Your friends out there are getting restless, and I ain't here to die for either of you. Silas's jaw tightened, his eyes darting between Clara and Delilah, a storm of emotions flickering across his face. You're working with them? He asked, his voice low, a dangerous edge to it that made Delilah's heart skip. You with her stepfather's crew now? Clara laughed, a short, bitter sound. You think I'd stoop that low? I'm here for my own reasons, Silas. Same as always. She paused, her eyes softening for a moment, and Delilah caught a glimpse of something deeper, pain, maybe, or regret. But I ain't your enemy, not today. The twist hit Delilah like a thunderclap. This woman wasn't just a stranger, she was part of Silas's past, a piece of the puzzle that explained the shadows in his eyes, the weight he carried. And she was here in this cave at the exact moment they needed an ally or a betrayal. Delilah's mind raced, her instincts torn between trust and suspicion. Was Clara a savior, or was she leading them into a trap? And why did the sight of her standing so close to Silas stir a pang in Delilah's chest, one she didn't want to name? Before she could speak, the sound of boots echoed from the passage. They'd come through, her stepfather's voice, closer now, snarling curses. They're in there, find 'em. The urgency snapped Silas into action, his hand grabbing Delilah's, pulling her toward the passage Clara had indicated. Move, he said, his voice tight, but his grip was gentle, grounding her. He glanced at Clara, his expression unreadable. You better not be playing us, Clara. I ain't in the mood for games. Clara's smile was sharp, almost daring. When have I ever played fair, Silas, she said. But she moved ahead, leading the way with a confidence that suggested she knew these caves better than she should. Delilah followed, her heart pounding, her mind swirling with questions. Who was this woman, and what hold did she have over Silas? And why did the thought of their shared history make Delilah's chest ache in ways she couldn't explain? As they slipped deeper into the dark, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, the Wild West closing its jaws around them. The twist of Clara's arrival had changed everything, and Delilah sensed that the truth about Silas and the danger they faced was only beginning to unravel. The cave's darkness swallowed Delilah Rose whole, the narrow passage pressing in like the walls of her old life, each step echoing with the weight of uncertainty. Silas Wright's hand, warm and steady, guided her forward, his touch a quiet anchor amidst the storm of her stepfather's shouts and their relentless pursuit closing in behind them. Ahead, Clara moved with a predator's grace, her long duster coat brushing the stone, her revolver glinting faintly in the dim light, filtering through cracks above. Her presence was a riddle wrapped in a threat, her cryptic words about Silas stirring a knot of unease in Delilah's chest. The Wild West had thrown them together, runaway cowboy an enigma, and as the sounds of pursuit grew louder, Delilah felt the weight of a truth she wasn't ready to face. Clara's arrival had shifted the ground beneath them, and the path ahead was anything but certain. The passage twisted, the air growing colder, the drip of unseen water a steady rhythm against the chaos. Clara paused at a fork, her sharp eyes scanning the shadows, her hand resting lightly on her revolver. "This way," she said, her voice low but commanding, nodding toward the left tunnel. "It'll take us out near the canyon. If we're lucky, we can lose them there." Lucky Silas muttered, his tone dry as the desert above. "Reckon luck's been in short supply today." His shoulder, still bound with Delilah's makeshift bandage, was stiff, the blood stain darker now, but he moved with a stubborn grit that made her heart ache. She wanted to check his wound to ease his pain, but the urgency of their flight left no room for tenderness. Still, the memory of their moment in the cave, the heat of his skin under her fingers, the intensity in his eyes lingered, making her hyper-aware of how close he stood, his breath warm against her neck as they squeezed through the tight passage. Delilah caught Clara's glance sharp and knowing, as if the woman could read every thought flickering through her mind. "Keep up, darlin'," Clara said, her lips curving in a half-smile that was equal parts tease and challenge. "Ain't got time for daydreaming about our cowboy here." The words hit like a spark, and Delilah's cheeks flushed, her grip tightening on her knife. She opened her mouth to retort, but Silas cut in, his voice gruff. "Save the chatter, Clara," he said, his eyes flicking to Delilah, a flicker of amusement softening his stern expression. "You're scaring the girl, and I need her focused." The comment was meant to diffuse the tension, but it only made Delilah's flush deepen, her pride bristling at being called out. She shot him a glare which he met with a raised eyebrow, his lips twitching as if he enjoyed riling her up. "Scaring me?" Delilah huffed, her voice low but sharp. "I've faced worse than her sharp-tongued Silas, right? Don't you dare treat me like some fragile flower." Her words were bold, but the awkwardness of the moment, standing between a cowboy who'd risked his life for her and a woman who seemed to know him too well, made her feel like she was walking a tightrope over a canyon. Clara's laugh, low and throaty, echoed off the stone. "Oh, I like her," she said, glancing at Silas with a look that was far too familiar for Delilah's liking. "She's got more spine than most of the fools you've run with." The compliment was double-edged, and Delilah's stomach twisted, caught between gratitude and a flare of jealousy she didn't want to admit. Who was this woman to Silas, and why did her every word feel like a claim on him? Before Silas could respond, a shout from behind, her stepfather's voice, raw with rage, shattered the moment. "They're in the caves. Spread out, find 'em." The clatter of boots and the metallic click of guns being cocked echoed closer, too close. Delilah's heart leapt into her throat, the humor of the moment evaporating as the reality of their danger crashed back in. Silas's hand found hers again, his grip firm, pulling her forward as Clara quickened her pace, leading them deeper into the labyrinth. The passage opened into a wider chamber, the ceiling soaring above, jagged stalactites hanging like teeth in a monster's maw. A faint glow from a distant exit beckoned, promising freedom, but the sounds of pursuit were relentless, growing louder with every second. Clara stopped abruptly, her hand raised, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the chamber. "Something's off," she whispered, her voice taut. "They shouldn't be this close. Not unless—" Unless what? Delilah demanded, her voice sharp with fear and frustration. She was tired of riddles, tired of running, tired of the secrets that seemed to swirl around Silas and Clara like dust in a storm. Clara's eyes flicked to Silas, a silent question passing between them, and Delilah felt that pang again, sharper now. Silas's jaw tightened, his gaze dropping for a moment before meeting Clara's. "You think it's him?" he asked, his voice low, the words heavy with a meaning Delilah couldn't grasp. "Him?" Delilah snapped, her patience fraying. "Who's him? What aren't you telling me?" The awkwardness of the moment was suffocating, the weight of their unspoken history pressing down on her. She was caught in a deadly chase, trusting two people she barely knew, and the realization made her feel like a fool. Silas sighed, rubbing the back of his neck, his expression caught between guilt and exasperation. "Ain't the time for this, Delilah," he said, but his tone softened as he met her eyes. "Claire and I, we got history, bad history, and there's a man out there, someone worse than your stepfather, who might be pulling the strings." Delilah's breath caught her mind reeling. Worse than her stepfather. The idea was almost unthinkable, but before she could press for answers, a new sound split the air, a sharp, deliberate whistle, eerie and out of place in the cave's gloom. Clara cursed under her breath, her hand flying to her revolver. "That's him," she said, her voice tight. "He's here." The drama surged as a figure stepped into the chamber, from a side passage, not her stepfather or his men, but a tall, lean man in a black coat, his hat pulled low, his eyes cold as a snake's. He carried a double-barreled shotgun, its muzzle pointed casually at the ground, but the threat was unmistakable. "Silas Wright," he drawled, his voice smooth and venomous. "And Clara. Ain't this a reunion for the ages?" His gaze slid to Delilah, a slow smile spreading across his face. "And you must be the runaway. Seems you've stirred up quite the hornet's nest." Delilah's blood ran cold, her knife feeling useless in her hand. This man wasn't just a bounty hunter, he was something else. Something darker, and the way Silas and Clara tensed told her he was no ordinary foe. Silas stepped in front of her, his rifle raised, but his voice was steady, almost resigned. "Jasper," he said, the name carrying a weight that made Delilah's skin prickle. "Didn't think you'd crawl out of whatever hole you've been hiding in." Jasper's laugh was cold, cutting through the chamber like a blade. "You owe me, Silas. Both of you do. And I ain't one to let debts go unpaid." He cocked his shotgun, the sound echoing like a death knell. Delilah's stepfather's shouts were closer now, merging with this new threat, and she realized with a sickening jolt that they were trapped, caught between her past and a vendetta she didn't understand. "Reckon we're in a pickle now." Silas muttered, his tone dry, despite the danger, and Delilah couldn't help the nervous laugh that escaped her. It was absurd finding humor in a moment like this, but it was all she had to keep from breaking. She met Silas's eyes, and for a fleeting second, the world shrank to just them, a shared spark of defiance that promised they'd fight no matter the odds. The chamber was a powder keg, and Jasper's cold smile was the match. The Wild West had thrown them into the fire, and as the sounds of pursuit closed in, Delilah knew the only way out was through together or not at all. The chamber's air was heavy with the promise of violence. Jasper's cold smile, a blade hanging over Delilah, rose. Silas Wright and Clara, as the echoes of her stepfather's shouts closed in like a noose. The man in the black coat stood before them, his double-barreled shotgun a silent threat, his eyes glinting with a vendetta that tied him to Silas and Clara, in ways Delilah could only guess at. Her heart pounded, her knife clutched tightly in her hand, its weight a small comfort against the storm brewing around them. Silas stood firm, his rifle raised, his wounded shoulder stiff but unyielding, while Clara's revolver was steady, her expression a mask of defiance, hiding whatever history bound her to this moment. The Wild West had brought them to this crucible, and as the sounds of pursuit grew louder, Delilah felt the weight of every choice that had led her here, running from her stepfather, trusting Silas, facing a past she didn't fully understand. But she wasn't the frightened girl who'd fled the cabin anymore, and she'd be damned if she let this end in chains. Jasper's voice cut through the tension, smooth and venomous. "You thought you could outrun me, Silas, after what you and Clara did." He took a step forward, his shotgun rising slightly, and Delilah's breath caught at the raw malice in his eyes. "That debt's been waiting a long time, and this girl's bounty is just the start of settling it." Silas's jaw tightened, his gaze never wavering. "Whatever you think I owe you, Jasper, it's between us. Leave her out of it." His voice was steel, but Delilah caught the flicker of guilt in his eyes, a shadow of a past she didn't know, but could feel like a weight on his shoulders. Clara shifted beside him, her revolver trained on Jasper, but her silence spoke volumes. Whatever Jasper's grudge was, it ran deep, and she was part of it. Before Delilah could demand answers, her stepfather's roar shattered the standoff, his heavy boots echoing as he burst into the chamber, flanked by the scarred man and one remaining rider. His bloodshot eyes locked onto Delilah, his face twisted with drunken fury. "There you are, you little wretch!" He bellowed, his revolver swinging toward her. "You're mine, and no cowboy's gonna change that." The chamber erupted into chaos. Jasper swung his shotgun toward Silas, but Clara was faster, firing a shot that grazed his arm, sending him staggering back with a curse. Silas dove to the side, pulling Delilah with him, as her stepfather's bullet tore into the stone where they'd stood. "Stay down!" Silas shouted, his voice a lifeline, as he returned fire. His shot clipping the scarred man's leg, sending him howling to the ground. Delilah scrambled behind a stalagmite, her knife ready, her heart pounding, with a fierce determination to fight, not flee. Clara moved like a shadow, her revolver spitting fire, as she kept Jasper at bay. But her eyes flicked to Silas, a silent plea passing between them. "We can't keep this up forever," she called, her voice tight. "Finish it, Silas, or we're all dead." Delilah's stepfather lunged toward her, his bulk terrifyingly fast despite his drunken sway. She slashed with her knife, catching his sleeve, but he grabbed her wrist, his grip like iron. "You'll pay for this," he snarled, his breath sour with whiskey. Panic surged through her, but she twisted, driving her knee into his gut with all the strength she'd found in the desert. He grunted, loosening his hold just enough for her to break free, stumbling back into Silas's arms. "Got you?" Silas said, his voice steady despite the chaos, his arm wrapping around her waist as he fired over her shoulder, forcing her stepfather to duck. The warmth of his touch, even in the heat of battle, sent a spark through her, a reminder of the bond they'd forged in the fire of the Wild West. But there was no time to dwell on it. Jasper had recovered, his shotgun raised, and Clara was pinned behind a rock, her ammunition running low. Delilah's eyes darted to the chamber's exit, the faint glow of daylight beckoning. "The canyon," she whispered, her mind racing. "We can make it if we go now." Silas nodded, his expression grim but resolute, and he grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the passage. Clara followed, firing one last shot to keep Jasper at bay. But as they ran, Delilah's stepfather's voice chased them, a promise of vengeance that chilled her blood. The passage spit them out into a narrow canyon, its red walls towering above the sun, casting long shadows across the rocky floor. They paused, gasping for breath, but the sounds of pursuit were relentless. Boots, shouts, the clatter of stones dislodged by chasing horses. Silas scanned the canyon, his eyes narrowing as he spotted a narrow ledge above, barely wide enough for a person. "Up there," he said, his voice urgent. "We can hold them off." Clara hesitated, her eyes meeting Silas's, a silent question hanging between them. "You sure about this?" she asked, her voice softer now, almost vulnerable. Delilah's chest tightened, the weight of their history, a shadow she couldn't shake, but Silas's answer was firm. "I'm sure," he said, his gaze shifting to Delilah, a promise in his eyes that steadied her. "For her." Clara nodded, a flicker of resignation crossing her face, and she started climbing, her movements swift despite the tension. Delilah followed, her hands scraping against the rough stone, Silas close behind, his steady presence urging her on. They reached the ledge, a precarious perch overlooking the canyon, and Silas positioned himself at the edge, his rifle ready. Delilah crouched beside him, her knife in hand, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and resolve. Clara took the other side, her revolver steady, and for a moment the three of them were a united front, bound by survival, if nothing else. Her stepfather and Jasper burst into the canyon below, their men limping behind, their faces twisted with rage. "You can't hide forever," her stepfather roared, his revolver raised, but Silas fired first. the shot kicking up dirt at his feet, forcing him back. Jasper's shotgun boomed the blast, shattering rock below the ledge, and Delilah flinched her body, pressing closer to Silas's. "Stay with me," Silas murmured, his voice low, his eyes meeting hers for a fleeting moment. The intensity in his gaze, the quiet strength, made her heart swell, and she nodded, her resolve hardening. This was her fight too, and she wouldn't let him face it alone. The battle was fierce but short. Clara's precise shots kept Jasper pinned, while Silas's relentless fire drove her stepfather and his men back, their numbers dwindling as one fled and another fell, clutching a wounded arm. Jasper, realizing the tide was turning, snarled and retreated, his black coat vanishing into the canyon shadows. Her stepfather, abandoned and outmatched, stood alone, his revolver shaking in his hand. "You're done," Silas called, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Walk away or you don't walk at all." The threat hung heavy, and Delilah saw the moment her stepfather's bravado cracked his eyes, darting to the empty canyon, his men gone, his power broken. With a final curse, he stumbled back, mounting his horse and fleeing into the dust, leaving Delilah's past in the dirt where it belonged. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the wind whistling through the canyon. Delilah's legs gave out, and she sank to the ledge, her knife clattering to the stone. Silas knelt beside her, his hand gentle on her shoulder, his touch grounding her in the aftermath. "You're free," he said softly, his gray eyes warm with a pride that made her heart ache. Clara stood apart, her expression unreadable, her revolver holstered. "You did good, Silas," she said, her voice quiet. "Both of you." She glanced at Delilah, a faint smile breaking through her guarded exterior. "Take care of him, darling. He's worth it." With that, she turned, climbing down the ledge and disappearing into the canyon, her duster coat fading into the shadows like a ghost from Silas's past. Delilah looked at Silas, her breath steadying as the weight of her freedom settled in. "What now?" she asked, her voice soft but steady, her eyes searching his. Silas smiled, a real smile this time, free of the shadows that had haunted him. "Now we ride west," he said, offering her his hand. "There's a whole world out there, Delilah, and I reckon we've earned a chance to see it." She took his hand, her fingers lacing with his, the locket at her throat glinting in the sunlight. The Wild West had tested her, forged her, and given her something she'd never dared to hope for: a partner, a purpose, and a future. As they climbed down to the canyon floor, the horizon stretched before them, vast and open, a canvas for a new story they'd write together. If you find it interesting, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment. Thank you very much.